Hello, everyone. Today we're going to dive into Schopenhauer's ideas, but from a different angle than usual. Instead of focusing on the metaphysics he explores in the world as will and representation, we'll examine his approach to rhetoric in a smaller, lesser-known book titled The Art of Always Being Right. Interestingly, this book has gained considerable popularity, to the point where Schopenhauer is sometimes better known for it than for his major work on metaphysics. This could be due to its brevity, as The Art of Always Being Right spans only about 20 to 30 pages, whereas The World as Will and Representation is approximately 1,200 pages long. This difference in length likely explains the wider reach of The Art of Always Being Right. Published in 1864, The Art of Always Being Right presents 38 strategies to win debates. Today, we'll explore Schopenhauer's perspective on heuristic dialectics, the art of using clever, sometimes cunning tactics to prevail in arguments. While there's a sarcastic tone to the book, reducing it to mere satire would be misleading. Schopenhauer also intended it as a guide for intellectual self-defense, helping readers recognize fallacies, sophisms, and manipulative techniques in discussions. Schopenhauer's 38 strategies include both intellectual and psychological tactics. He acknowledges that debate isn't merely an exchange of ideas. It's also influenced by emotions, which play a significant role in how we respond to an opponent's arguments. To truly win a debate, we must consider this emotional component alongside the intellectual arguments. Reducing the art of always being right to a mere critique of intellectual dishonesty would also be inaccurate. Schopenhauer himself writes in the book's introduction that sometimes defending an idea requires using rhetorical tools, as truth alone may not always be persuasive. In these cases, rhetorical devices are useful to help the right idea gain traction. Schopenhauer argues that debate is not solely about discovering truth, but also about persuading others of our own version of it. The language of debate is often infused with military terminology. We speak of opposing arguments, intellectual weapons, and winning a debate. Schopenhauer diverges from the Socratic ideal of seeking truth and instead aligns with the concept of heuristic dialectics, using rhetoric as a form of intellectual combat. For those interested in reading the book, I recommend paying close attention to the introduction. Schopenhauer explains our deep-seated need to be right, especially in public, which he attributes to human vanity. Vanity drives us to focus on appearances over substance, valuing praise and validation over truth. This inclination leads people to prioritize winning the debate over seeking wisdom. Humans often resist admitting they're wrong because it feels like a loss of credibility and an admission of weakness. Instead, we stubbornly cling to our beliefs, thinking that as long as we stand firm, we won't lose face. This tenacity can lead to intellectual dishonesty, driven by a need for stability and validation in social interactions. Schopenhauer suggests that people defend ideas not just for their truth, but because those ideas are tied to their self-image. Defending a belief can feel as crucial as defending one's life, leading people to employ any means necessary, regardless of the truth. This defense mechanism stems from the need to protect one's identity and worldview, and thus, Schopenhauer contends that we're often more lenient toward arguments that align with our beliefs. The desire to win can become a struggle for recognition and validation, with debates turning into contests of ego rather than genuine intellectual exchange. Philosopher Hegel also discussed this struggle for recognition in his exploration of human consciousness. In this sense, the intellectual debate becomes a means of affirming one's identity. In this video, we won't go over all 38 strategies outlined by Schopenhauer, but we'll focus on 5 commonly used tactics. The aim is to review these techniques in an engaging way to help you recognize rhetorical traps. Let's begin with the first strategy I've chosen to highlight. Stratagem 8. Anger the opponent. In this video, we'll explore Stratagem 8. Anger the opponent. Imagine saying, "Please let me speak and stop interrupting incessantly," or something like, "Listen, "I wasn't finished speaking," reminiscent of a minister addressing an unruly audience. This strategy highlights that the art of debate isn't just about mastering rhetorical devices or language. It's also about provoking emotions, stirring up the opponent, making them lose their composure, and pushing them away from rationality. The romantic notion of intellectual debate as a pure clash of ideas, untouched by emotions, is often unrealistic. Anyone who has debated knows that emotions are always at play. Angering an opponent can be achieved in many ways, but one of the most effective is through contempt, showing disdain for either the opponent's ideas or the opponent personally. This contempt can be subtle and need not be conveyed through words. A dismissive attitude, a certain gaze, or an act of ignoring the other can be just as effective. For instance, imagine saying, "We're going to beat Mr. Sarkozy every night, and we're going to beat you too, because you're useless." Such statements are designed to undermine and aggravate. Faced with this kind of tactic, the best response is often the stoic approach, emotionally detached from the opponent, ignoring their provocations. The more detached you are from the emotional traps set by your adversary, the better equipped you are to counter them and even turn the strategy back on them. After all, nothing frustrates contempt more than a response of indifference. Responding with, "Your attempts to provoke me leave me entirely unmoved," or "I'm here to engage in meaningful discourse," unaffected by such ploys, can be highly effective. Emotional detachment not only shields you from these tactics, but often irritates your opponent further, allowing you to maintain the upper hand in the debate. Stratagem 12. Choosing favorable metaphors. The title of this stratagem, Choosing Favorable Metaphors, is somewhat misleading. In reality, Schopenhauer is discussing the power of vocabulary, the words we choose to describe things. According to Schopenhauer, every word carries a connotation, which can be either positive or negative, and the objective is to exploit these connotations to strengthen our own arguments and refute those of our opponents. For example, Schopenhauer contrasts the words Protestant and heretic. The term Protestant was created by Protestants to describe themselves, while heretic was coined by Catholics to describe Protestants in a negative light. By using heretic instead of Protestant, a speaker automatically implies judgment, priming the listener to view Protestants unfavorably. This isn't about distorting reality, but rather about presenting it from a perspective that aligns with one's own interests. Another example is the Enlightenment philosophers' use of terms like religion and superstition. Religion retained respectability, while superstition was a dismissive term that implied ignorance and backwardness. This allowed critics to paint religious practices as obsolete or even ridiculous. In modern contexts, consider how terms like dictator and populist are used. Labeling a leader as a dictator frames them as tyrannical, setting up opposition against them as morally justified. Similarly, populist often carries a dismissive or negative undertone, suggesting a rational or dangerous appeal to mass sentiment. Schopenhauer points out that choosing words with the right connotations can lead listeners to draw conclusions before they've even heard the reasoning. It's a form of circular logic. The connotation is presented as evidence, leading listeners to accept a judgment without objective support. This tactic can limit debate, trapping opponents within linguistic frames that are difficult to escape. As a countermeasure, it's essential to be vigilant about the terminology your opponent uses and to question the implications behind their word choices. By doing so, you expose any bias in their language and can neutralize the influence of these connotations. This manipulation of vocabulary is similar to the concept of newspeak in George Orwell's 1984, where language controls thought and opinion. In sum, when you notice a word being used to replace another, pay attention to the subtle presuppositions it carries and challenge their significance. Recognizing this tactic is a powerful tool for maintaining clarity and control in discourse. Stratagem 18. Interrupt and divert the debate. In Stratagem 18, Schopenhauer suggests that if we realize our opponent is building an argument that may lead to our defeat, we should interrupt their reasoning before they reach their conclusion. By doing so, we distract and divert the discussion to a different subject, which can shift the focus away from their argument. This strategy closely relates to stratagem 29, which involves creating a diversion to avoid confronting difficult topics. This tactic often occurs when a speaker is less knowledgeable about the subject and feels threatened by deeper technical discussions. To prevent being put in a position where they lack answers, they might continuously change the topic. To counter this, Schopenhauer advises mastering the subjects we discuss, so we can confidently engage in any aspect of the debate and avoid the need to divert or distract. Experienced debaters may use intellectual discontinuity, the skill of jumping from one topic to another just as the conversation begins to require detailed reasoning. This tactic can be frustrating, as it prevents meaningful, in-depth discussion. When someone interrupts or changes the subject in this way, it can signal their own insecurity or lack of mastery. If you find yourself facing someone who interrupts to avoid a topic, you can turn the strategy against them by pointing out the diversion. Ask if they might be hesitant to explore the subject further. This approach not only brings the diversion tactic to light, but also places you in control of the discussion, as it challenges their willingness to confront the core argument. Highlighting the diversion subtly implies that they are avoiding the substance of the debate, which can undermine their credibility. By recognizing and addressing this tactic, you avoid being sidetracked and gain the upper hand, since there's nothing more discrediting than having an attempted trap exposed. Using this awareness strategically allows you to maintain focus and effectively counter those who might otherwise seek to avoid meaningful discourse. Stratagem 25. Find an exception. In Stratagem 25, Schopenhauer suggests that one can weaken a general statement by pointing out an exception, casting doubt on the overall validity of the rule. In our current society, generalizations are often viewed with skepticism, as they may seem to disregard unique cases or individual distinctions. However, this fear of generalization sometimes leads to absurdities, where pointing out an exception is mistakenly taken as proof that the general rule is invalid. Schopenhauer uses the example of the black swan. The discovery of one black swan in a world of white swans doesn't negate the general rule that most swans are white. Similarly, the existence of flying fish doesn't mean most fish aren't bound to water. Exceptions can qualify or contextualize a rule, but they don't necessarily negate it. When we forbid ourselves from making generalizations, we risk denying obvious patterns and truths in favor of focusing solely on outliers. This aversion to generalizing often arises from a confusion between generalization and stigmatization. People fear that generalizing might unfairly exclude or misrepresent specific cases, but the very concept of an exception implies the existence of a rule. Exceptions exist precisely because there is a general framework from which they deviate. For instance, pointing to a few smokers who don't develop lung cancer doesn't invalidate the broader evidence that smoking is harmful to health. If, during a debate, your opponent cites an exception as a means to invalidate your general argument, you can turn this tactic against them. Highlight that exceptions don't erase the validity of the rule. Instead, they provide context without undermining the overarching principle. This approach helps you reassert the general rule while acknowledging that exceptions, though real, don't disprove the larger truth. Stratagem 32. Principle of degrading association. Stratagem 32 is about discrediting an argument by associating it, even tenuously, with something negative or socially disapproved. When we are unable to counter an opponent's ideas directly, we can try to discredit them by linking their ideas or associations to controversial or disreputable groups or ideologies. This tactic is frequently used in contemporary debates, particularly in politics, where opponents are often undermined not by challenging their ideas, but by associating them with groups that are widely condemned. For example, if a person has previously interacted with individuals from a controversial group, even in a non-supportive context, this association can be used to suggest they share the group's ideas. Terms like frequenting, flirting with, or close to a particular ideology are often employed to subtly discredit someone without addressing their actual arguments. The strength of this stratagem lies in its ability to create guilt by association, even when the association is superficial. If an opponent resorts to this strategy, it often indicates they lack substantive arguments against the ideas presented. If they had concrete criticisms, they would focus on disputing the actual content of your ideas rather than your associations. When confronted with this stratagem, a useful response is to redirect the discussion to the substance of your arguments. Ask them to clarify specifically which aspects of your ideas they dispute, rather than focusing on supposed associations. By doing this, you force them back onto the actual topic and highlight the weakness of their degrading association tactic. This can help expose the lack of genuine argument in their attempt to discredit by association and reinforce the strength of your ideas based on their own merits. In conclusion, the principle of degrading association allows one to sidestep debating ideas directly by discrediting the speaker through associations. Recognizing this tactic and calling it out can help maintain focus on the actual arguments rather than getting lost in attempts to undermine through tenuous connections. Conclusion: the need to be right often reflects our insecurities, our vulnerability, and a desire for validation. When we have genuine confidence in ourselves and a detachment from external validation, we no longer feel compelled to prove we're right. Instead, our focus shifts to discovering the truth, expanding our understanding, and remaining open to growth. As Socrates famously said, "All I know is that I know nothing." This statement captures the essence of knowledge as a dynamic journey. Initially, we know nothing. Then we think we know. Eventually, we realize that our understanding is not absolute truth, but a belief, open to being tested and transformed. This realization is liberating, allowing us to let go of rigid beliefs and to understand that knowledge is not static. It evolves. True wisdom lies in recognizing that our beliefs are temporary and will continue to mature and adapt over time. The need to be right often stems from defining ourselves through our ideas, as if these ideas were our mental skin. When we cling to them, it is because they provide a sense of identity and stability. However, real growth occurs when we detach our self-worth from our beliefs. This detachment enables us to explore challenging questions, embrace uncertainties, and remain open to new perspectives. Ultimately, knowledge doesn't eradicate belief. Instead, it helps us understand that beliefs are not final truths. They are adaptable, growing, and evolving. In acknowledging this, we embrace a journey of continuous learning and transformation. Beliefs that evolve don't die. They demonstrate vitality, showing us that intellectual and personal growth are lifelong pursuits. Thank you